Newly sworn in Representative Cori Bush's resolution to remove GOP members for inciting attack on Capitol Hill. Will this result in people being held accountable? For insight into this, let's turn to our first guest. He's a frequent collaborator with all major news outlets and author of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Sure, glad to be here as always.
So dozens of lawmakers are co-sponsoring a resolution introduced today by freshman Congresswoman Cori Bush that aims to launch investigations for removal of Republicans in the House of Representatives who, along with President Trump, sparked a violent takeover of the Capitol last Wednesday. Caleb, your thoughts?
Well, the legal basis for all of this is interesting, and I have a feeling that this is going to end up in court and probably the Supreme Court, most likely. So the legal basis that the Democrats are using is the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the U.S. Civil War, which basically said anyone who's ever engaged in insurrection against the U.S. government, i.e. Confederates, they cannot hold public office. And that was passed. That was the U.S. Constitution. So, it's constitutional law. However, the question remains that basically what is being considered insurrection against the U.S. government is a rally that Donald Trump and his supporters had, which Donald Trump said, "I'll meet you at the Capitol." He said, "We got to not be weak." I believe other speakers at this rally invoked trial by combat, et cetera. And as that rally concluded, a number of Trump supporters went to Capitol Hill and broke a lot of things and smashed a lot of property, and people were killed, and it was very, very ugly. And this raises a lot of constitutional questions, namely because there have been a number of Supreme Court rulings about speech and what kind of speech can and cannot be outlawed. For example, there's a very infamous ruling called Brandenburg versus Ohio, in which Charles Brandenburg in Ohio in 1969, who was the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, he gave a televised speech that he paid for on television and called for acts of revengeance against members of Congress who voted for the Civil Rights Act. And of course, he was immediately arrested for this. And the Supreme Court said, well, as long as he didn't call for a specific act, as long as there was not a direct threat, that it was okay for Charles Brandenburg to do what he did. There's also a 1982 court ruling, the NAACP versus this hardware store, in which there was a boycott of a hardware store, and there were some incendiary speeches given at an NAACP rally, and then there was some property destruction and violence against this hardware store. And the Supreme Court said the NAACP is not responsible for that. They may have given a speech here or there that may have fired somebody up, but you can't hold the NAACP responsible for a speech that may have incited somebody to do something. Now, there's another question, though, which is that Donald Trump and Republican members of Congress, keep in mind that they could be interpreted as functioning in their role as elected officials here, right? And that then doesn't give them the same level of free speech protections. If Donald Trump was telling his supporters what he told them in capacity as the president, then he doesn't have the same level of protection. Then all of a sudden he's acting as an elected official, as a public official, as a representative of the American government. So his speech is held to much stricter standards. So this is raising all kinds of constitutional questions. I think there seems to be widespread agreement from Republicans, Democrats, all across the country that what happened on Capitol Hill last Wednesday was completely unacceptable and completely wrong. But now the question is, legally speaking, how are people held accountable? And does this make people unfit for public office under the 14th Amendment? And it's a big legal question, and I expect this will be in court for a long time.
Well, Caleb, it's interesting that you bring up those constitutional questions because there's another one at hand here, and that is regarding President Trump being tossed off of Twitter. The ACLU here in Maryland and some other organizations had a lawsuit against the governor because basically some people, on Twitter, online made some negative comments about him, and he blocked them. And the argument was, look, that's a public forum, and you cannot block citizens simply because they criticize you in a public forum. And it was ruled on behalf of the plaintiffs, so he couldn't block people. Now, there is a similar case heading for the Supreme Court, even as we speak, that argues the same thing, that the president couldn't block people off of his Twitter account because it's a public forum, which I argue it is a public forum, and a politician should not be able to block people who criticize them with legitimate complaints or even illegitimate complaints, as long as it's nothing, they don't say they're going to kill him or something. So we're seeing this discussion about these constitutional discussions arise, and mainly because there are people that want to take subsequent acts to the occupation of the Capitol. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, we have seen a huge crackdown on social media. Playtime is over, and the crackdown is coming. And what was already done to WikiLeaks is now happening all across the country, and it seems a lot of people are having their pages taken down. And I think that the events on Capitol Hill have kind of created a perfect storm. George W. Bush, he won the 2000 election. I mean, the Supreme Court gave it to him. But he came into office not with a strong mandate. There was still a lot of opposition to him. But then 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden, George W. Bush had a blank check. And it was almost 2 years before there was strong opposition to Bush in Congress at all. Bush, it seemed, had so much sympathy following 9/11 because everyone was so shocked by what had happened, because he had rallied the nation and stood at the site of Ground Zero with a bullhorn. Bush had this mandate based on events that happened long after he was elected. And I think that you can make a similar comparison to this, which is that, Biden won the election. It appears to me there may have been fraud here or there, but he won. He's the legitimate winner of the election. But there was still widespread opposition, and Donald Trump's supporters were still mad about it. But then this happened at the Capitol Hill, the events that took place. And now it seems like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and Silicon Valley and forces that want censorship are going to have the upper hand for a few months at least, because the nation is still shocked by what it saw. And it played that role, unfortunately. And I think that now is the moment that civil libertarians, those advocates of free speech, those opposing social media censorship, are going to be on the defensive, with people not listening to them for a little bit at least. I expect that we're going to see a swarm of opposition. And I also expect that when Biden takes office and Kamala Harris is sworn in as vice president, that there is going to be some swift, dramatic moves from the Democratic Party. They will do a lot of very dramatic things because opposition to them will be muted by the shock and the aftermath of what took place. That is my prediction. And some of what may come may be tech censorship. There may also be some other reforms that come in. There may even be some progressive moves that come in terms of economic reforms that'll be done in the hopes of stabilizing the country. But I expect that the Biden administration will move very, very quickly when they come into office, because right now things in the country seem to be pretty well aligned in their favor.
Oh, hey, Wilmer, before you go, let me just read one quick tweet to you. This is from Louise Minch. It says, ban all variants of Sputnik and RT from the West. Interview all of their journalists who we know to be spies and expel them. I just wanted to throw that in there. Go ahead, Wilmer.
Wow. Well, if they expel me back home to California, okay.
It's hard to expel me. I'm already home.
I love Sacramento. So yeah, send me home. Three things quickly, Caleb, in listening to you, a couple things that popped into my head. One, riot versus insurrection. There are different outlets that are describing what I consider to be the insurrection that took place on Wednesday as a riot. There is the English language definition to an act or action, and then there are legal definitions to acts and actions. And I think that there are some that are intentionally staying away from calling this an insurrection because they want to keep it in the context of a riot. The other, an officer was killed, Officer Schicknick was killed during this insurrection. Some believe that he was hit in the head with a fire extinguisher. That would, if proven to be true, would be murder. One then wonders, if your language incited an insurrection and a death occurred in the course of it, are you an accessory to murder? And the third point is the Democrats trying to politically maneuver this tightrope here with the first 100 days of Biden's administration. And there are those that don't want to, quote unquote, anger the insurrectionists, and they don't want to alienate these people, as though you can actually get these cows back in the barn. Caleb Maupin.
Well, one thing I do have questions about the term insurrection, because I think insurrection, and not just the word insurrection, but a lot of liberals are referring this to this as an attempted coup. And I mean, while what happened was completely unethical, and I think Trump should be held accountable for it, and it shows that his movement is very dangerous, and I mean, it's just awful. Do we really think that, that crowd of QAnon people were like storming the Capitol and that they were hoping to drive Congress out and declare, Buffalo Head, Jake and Jelly, the head of Congress or something? Like this was like, an armed seizure of power. I mean,
no, their stated objective was to lay siege to the electoral votes that were in those 3 boxes and to stop Congress from validating the election.
Yeah, I mean, but did they really have a chance of succeeding? I mean, I didn't see a faction of the military on their side. I didn't see a plan for what they were going to do after they seized the Capitol. I mean, it looked to me like this was an act of violent protest and property destruction, and it was certainly awful. And the complicity of the Capitol Police in allowing it to happen is something that I've noticed is slippery, because at first, I saw that many voices on the left, who, people who've been to anti-war protests many times in their lives, like myself, know that, if there's a protest on Capitol Hill, the crowds don't just run in. And in a lot of cases, these crowds ran in through doors that were wide open and no one stopped them. And, and so then many people on the left were condemning the Capitol Police for allowing this to happen. But then Rudy Giuliani, with his narrative, suddenly blamed it, and suddenly it became Nancy Pelosi's Capitol Police that were responsible. It wasn't just Capitol Police, it was Nancy Pelosi's Capitol Police, and that this was all a big false flag by Antifa or something. So now we've got the voices on the left saying, well, we can't blame the Capitol Police for it, and if you do, you're repeating Rudy Giuliani's narrative, and no, this is all them, and look, they killed a police officer, and it's the narrative of this just keeps evolving and going back and forth, and everyone changes their position based on what somebody else said. And it looks to me like it might be years before we find out exactly all of what went into happening here. How much of this was spontaneous? How much of this was planned? How high up in the Trump movement did this go? Was this QAnon renegades, or was this from the top? Did Trump plan this from the top and sit down and say, we're going to do this, and then we're going to dissociate ourselves from it? We may never really know, but there will be years of investigations, I'm sure. There's going to be books published just on this incident, I can guarantee you.
Caleb Maupin, as always, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis. And as always, Caleb, we look forward to having you back.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, man.
Yep.
You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by Garland Nixon, if they haven't sent Garland Nixon back. More on the other side. Stay tuned.